In the rugged foothills of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, where the land speaks in whispers and the mountains keep secrets, the Blackwood Ranch stood as a testament to one man's determination and another's shame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 15 years, Jackson Blackwood kept his only daughter, Eliza, hidden from the world behind heavy curtains and locked doors. The young girl, blind since birth, became the rancher's unspoken burden, a beautiful wildflower growing in darkness. But fate has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. When a traveling Cheyenne healer named Daniel Running Bear arrived in the valley with claims of ancient medicine that could restore sight to the blind, it set in motion a story of hope, healing, and unexpected redemption that would change the Blackwood family forever. This is the remarkable true story of a father's shame, a daughter's courage, and the Native American healer who dared to challenge the impossible. The year was 1887, and Jackson Blackwood's cattle empire stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land. A respected figure in Clearwater County, Jackson was known for his fair dealings, hard work, and the impenetrable wall of privacy he maintained around his personal life. Few people in the nearby town of Riverton knew much about the Blackwood household. Beyond the occasional glimpses of Jackson's wife, Margaret, during her rare trips to town for supplies, fewer still knew about the existence of young Eliza Blackwood, the couple's only child, who at 15 years old had never set foot in town, never attended the local school, and had become something of a ghost story among local children. "Widower Blackwood runs that ranch with an iron fist," local shopkeeper Thomas Miller would say to newcomers. "Lost his wife to fever years back, poor man. Some say there's a child too, a daughter, but no one's ever seen her. Not that I recall." Anyway, what Thomas and the other townsfolk didn't know was that Eliza was very much real and very much alive behind the walls of the sprawling ranch house that sat nestled against the foothills. Born with a rare condition that left her completely blind, Eliza had become Jackson's carefully guarded secret, a source of deep shame for a man who prided himself on perfection and strength. Margaret Blackwood had fought fiercely against her husband's decision to keep their daughter isolated. "She needs friends, Jackson. She needs to feel the sun on her face and hear other children laugh," Margaret had pleaded during one of their many arguments on the subject when Eliza was just 7 years old. And has she been what? The town's curiosity, the blind Blackwood girl who trips over her own feet and can't tell day from night? Jackson had fired back, his voice sharp, with an emotion deeper than anger. "No, I won't have my daughter pitied. I won't have the Blackwood name whispered about in every shop and saloon from here to Helena." Margaret had seen through her husband's bravado to the fear beneath. It wasn't shame alone that drove Jackson's decision, but a desperate, misguided attempt to protect his child from a world he believed would only hurt her. By the time Margaret realized the damage this isolation was causing, her own health had begun to fail. She died of pneumonia when Eliza was just 10 years old, leaving the girl alone with her father and the ranch hands who were under strict orders never to mention her existence to outsiders. For Eliza, the ranch house had become both sanctuary and prison. Unable to see the physical boundaries that contained her, she had nonetheless learned them intimately. 22 steps from her bedroom to the kitchen, 17 to the study, 34 to the back porch, where she was permitted to sit during quiet afternoons when her father was away tending to the cattle. Despite her isolation, Eliza had developed an astonishing acuity of her other senses. She could identify any of the ranch hands by the cadence of their footsteps, could tell which direction the wind was blowing by its scent, and had trained her fingers to read the raised letterbooks that her mother had ordered from back east. Before her death, Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan, a widow from town who came 3 times a week to cook and clean, became Eliza's primary connection to the outside world after Margaret's passing. Though under strict instructions from Jackson not to indulge the girl's curiosity too much, Mrs. Sullivan couldn't help but answer Eliza's endless questions about town life, current events, and the world beyond the ranch. "What color is the new dress fabric at the general store?" Eliza would ask, her sightless eyes focused somewhere past Mrs. Sullivan's shoulder. "It's a deep blue, like the sky just after sunset," Mrs. Sullivan would reply, folding linens as she spoke, with tiny yellow flowers embroidered along the hem. "Yellow like butter or yellow like sunshine?" Eliza would press, trying to construct the image in her mind. "Sunshine, dear. Bright as the dandelions that grow along the creek in springtime." These small conversations sustained Eliza through long days of solitude. When alone, she would often sit by her bedroom window, feeling the warmth of sunlight on her face and constructing elaborate mental images of the world from the sounds and smells that reached her. The distant lowing of cattle, the sharp tang of pine carried on the breeze, the rumble of wagon wheels on the road half a mile away. Jackson rarely spent time with his daughter beyond brief, awkward dinners where conversation was sparse. It wasn't that he didn't love her. In his own way, he loved her fiercely, but he found himself paralyzed by her condition, unsure how to connect with a child who couldn't see his expressions or share in the visual world that had defined his own life. His discomfort manifested as distance, and as the years passed, that distance had grown into a chasm neither knew how to bridge. The ranch hands, for their part, maintained a respectful but curious distance from the Blackwood girl. Only Walter Hayes, the elderly foreman who had worked for Jackson since before Eliza's birth, made an effort to acknowledge her presence, tipping his hat whenever he passed her on the porch and occasionally bringing her small treasures from the fields, interestingly shaped stones, a hawk feather, or a particularly aromatic wildflower. "Here you go, Miss Eliza," he'd say, placing the items in her waiting hands. "Something new for your collection." Eliza treasured these small acts of kindness, carefully arranging Walter's gifts on the window ledge in her bedroom where she could easily find them. They were tangible reminders that she existed to someone beyond her father and Mrs. Sullivan. As her 15th birthday approached in the early summer of 1887, Eliza found herself increasingly restless with the boundaries of her world. The dreams that had once been confined to her immediate surroundings began to expand, nourished by the books Mrs. Sullivan read to her. Tales of great cities, ocean voyages, and lives vastly different from her own. "Mrs. Sullivan," she asked one warm afternoon as they sat shelling peas on the back porch, "do you think I'll ever leave the ranch?" Mrs. Sullivan's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythmic work. "I don't know, child. Your father, he believes he's protecting you." "From what?" Eliza pressed, her voice carrying an edge it never had before. "From living," the older woman sighed. "Your father is a complicated man, Eliza. He lost his own mother when he was young, then your mother, and I think he's terrified of losing you too." "He's already lost me," Eliza said softly. "He just doesn't know it yet." That evening, as a summer storm rolled across the valley, bringing with it the sharp scent of rain and ozone, Jackson returned from a cattle sale in a neighboring county with news that would unknowingly set in motion the greatest change in his daughter's sheltered existence. "There's a man in town," he mentioned to Mrs. Sullivan as she served dinner, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that Eliza could hear every word from her place at the table. "Some Cheyenne fellow traveling through, calls himself a medicine man or healer of some sort." "Oh?" Mrs. Sullivan replied, placing a bowl of potatoes on the table. "What brings him to Riverton?" Jackson snorted dismissively. "Claims he can cure ailments that white doctors can't. Got half the town fooled with some demonstration at the Mercantile today. Supposedly helped old man Jenkins with his arthritis right there on the spot. Jenkins swears he hasn't been able to make a fist in years until this Indian worked on him. Eliza's heart quickened at this casual conversation, but she kept her face carefully neutral, having learned long ago that showing too much interest in the outside world would only make her father more determined to shield her from it. People will believe anything when they're desperate, Jackson continued, cutting into his steak. Doc Williams is furious, of course, says it's all suggestions and theatrics. Mrs. Sullivan made a non-committal sound as she took her seat. What's his name, this healer? Daniel something. Running Bear, I think they said. Speaks better English than half the cowboys in town. Educated somewhere back east, apparently, before returning to his people's ways. He's set up at the edge of town, and Mayor Parker's letting him stay for a week before moving on. A week. The word echoed in Eliza's mind like a promise. A week meant possibility. A week meant she had time to form a plan. That night, after the house had gone quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the old timber frame settling, Eliza lay awake in her bed, her mind racing with possibilities. In all her 15 years, she had never considered that her blindness might be curable. It was simply the state of her existence, like the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. But now a seed of hope had been planted, taking root in fertile ground long deprived of such nourishment. What if this Cheyenne healer could help her? What if she could see the ranch, the mountains, her father's face? What if she could finally step beyond the boundaries that had defined her entire life? The questions swirled in her mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind. But beneath them lay a more fundamental question. How could she, a blind girl who had never been allowed beyond the ranch house yard, possibly make her way to town to meet this healer? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the first light of dawn filtered through her curtains, warming her face with its gentle touch, Eliza made a decision. For once in her life, she would need to trust someone completely, and that someone would have to be Walter Hayes. The following morning, Eliza woke before sunrise, a plan forming in her mind like a distant melody, gradually coming into focus. She dressed carefully in her Sunday best, a pale blue cotton dress with pearl buttons that Mrs. Sullivan had described as the color of forget-me-nots, and pinned her long chestnut hair back with the silver combs that had once belonged to her mother. Navigating through the quiet house with practiced ease, Eliza made her way to the kitchen, where she knew Mrs. Sullivan would soon arrive to begin breakfast preparations. The cook always came early on Tuesdays and Thursdays to bake fresh bread for the ranch hands, entering through the back door with a key Jackson had entrusted to her years ago. True to routine, Mrs. Sullivan arrived just as the first birds began their morning chorus. "Merciful heavens, child," the older woman exclaimed upon finding Eliza sitting at the kitchen table. "What are you doing up at this hour, and in your good dress, no less?" "I need your help, Mrs. Sullivan," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "And Walter's too." Mrs. Sullivan set down her basket of supplies and pulled out a chair. "What kind of help, dear?" "I want to see the healer in town, the Cheyenne man's father mentioned yesterday." A heavy silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Eliza could almost hear Mrs. Sullivan's thoughts racing, weighing loyalty to her employer against the desperate hope in a young girl's face. "Eliza," the cook finally said, her voice gentle but firm, "your father would never allow it. You know that." "I know," Eliza acknowledged. "That's why I need your help. Father is riding out to the north pasture today with most of the men to move the herd. He mentioned it at dinner last night, remember? He won't be back until sundown." Mrs. Sullivan's chair creaked as she shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Walter could take me into town in the small wagon. We could be there and back before father returns. No one else needs to know. And if this medicine man can't help you, have you considered that possibility?" Mrs. Sullivan's voice was tinged with both concern and something else, a reluctant curiosity perhaps, or the first glimmer of hope. Eliza reached across the table, finding Mrs. Sullivan's weathered hand with unerring accuracy. "Then I'll be no worse off than I am now. But if there's even the smallest chance, don't I deserve—" "That chance?" Mrs. Sullivan sighed deeply, a sound Eliza had come to recognize as surrender. "Let me speak to Walter. I can't promise anything, mind you." An hour later, as the morning sun cleared the eastern mountains, Walter Hayes stood in the kitchen, his hat in his hands, listening as Mrs. Sullivan explained Eliza's request. "It's madness," the foreman said when she finished. "If the boss finds out, I'll lose my job. You'll lose yours too, Eleanor." "I know the risk," Mrs. Sullivan replied. "But look at her, Walter. 15 years she's been locked away in this house. 15 years without seeing a doctor who might actually help her condition." Walter's boots scraped against the floorboards as he paced the small kitchen. "The boss took me on when no one else would hire a man my age," he said, his voice heavy, with conflicted loyalty. "Gave me this position, trusted me to run things when he's away. And you've repaid that trust 1,000 times over," Mrs. Sullivan insisted. "But there's a higher loyalty here, Walter, to what's right." A long silence followed, during which Eliza held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Walter finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision not easily made. "The small wagon will attract less attention," he said slowly, "and we'll need to take the old logging road past Miller's Creek. Fewer chances of being seen that way." Eliza's heart soared, but she kept her composure, nodding solemnly as Walter laid out his conditions. "You'll need to cover your head with a bonnet and keep your face down if we pass anyone on the road. I'll say you're my niece from Helena if anyone asks. We stay no more than an hour in town, and if this healer can't see you right away, we turn around and come straight back. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I understand completely. And you—" Walter turned to Mrs. Sullivan, though Eliza could sense the gesture from the shift in his voice. "We'll need to make some excuse if anyone comes looking. For either of us. Say I've gone to check the fence line in the south pasture and that the girl is resting with a headache. I can manage that," Mrs. Sullivan agreed. Within the hour, Walter had hitched the small wagon to Daisy, the gentlest of the ranch's horses. Mrs. Sullivan wrapped a simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples in a cloth and pressed it into Walter's hands. "God go with you both," she whispered as she helped Eliza onto the wagon seat. The journey into town was unlike anything Eliza had ever experienced. Having never ventured beyond the immediate surroundings of the ranch house, each new sound, smell, and sensation was a revelation. The rhythmic clip-clop of Daisy's hooves on the packed dirt road, the changing scents as they moved from pine-covered hills to open meadows, the feel of the summer breeze carrying new fragrances she couldn't identify. All of it washed over her in waves of discovery. "Tell me what you see, Mr. Hayes," she asked as they traveled, hungry for descriptions of the world she'd been denied. Walter, initially taciturn from anxiety, gradually warmed to the role of narrator. "We're passing through a stretch of aspen trees now," he told her. "Their leaves are catching the sunlight, silver green and trembling. Looks like 1,000 tiny mirrors catching the light. Beyond that, there's rolling grassland stretched out toward the mountains. Wildflowers are in bloom, purple lupine and Indian paintbrush, the color of sunset." "What color is the sky today?" Eliza asked, tilting her face upward to feel the sun's warmth. "Clear blue with just a few wispy clouds high up," Walter replied. "The kind of day your mother used to call God's own perfect creation." Eliza smiled at the mention of her mother, grateful for this small connection to a woman whose face she could not remember, but whose voice and gentle touch still lived in her memories. As they approached the outskirts of Riverton, the sounds of civilization began to intrude on the natural symphony that had accompanied their journey. The hammering from a blacksmith's forge, the shouts of children playing, the rumble of wagons on the main street. "We're coming into town now," Walter said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Remember to keep your head down." Eliza nodded, pulling her bonnet lower as instructed, though the irony of hiding her blindness while seeking a cure for it wasn't lost on her. "Where will we find the healer?" she asked. "Mayor Parker said he's set up at the edge of town, near the creek," Walter replied. "We'll go there directly." The wagons slowed as Walter navigated through Riverton's main street. Though Eliza couldn't see the curious glances thrown their way, she could feel the weight of attention in the sudden hush of conversations as they passed. It seemed the arrival of strangers was still a noteworthy event in the small town. "There's quite a gathering by the creek," Walter murmured after several minutes. "Looks like half the town is waiting to see this medicine man." Disappointment threatened to overwhelm Eliza. "Will we have to wait too? You said we only have an hour." "Let me see what I can do," Walter said, bringing the wagon to a stop. "Wait here." Eliza sat alone on the wagon seat, straining her ears to catch snippets of conversation from the crowd nearby. Various ailments were mentioned: rheumatism, consumption, a child's persistent fever, along with hushed speculations about the Cheyenne healer's methods and the likelihood of success. He touched Jenkins' hands, and the swelling went down right. "Before our eyes," one woman said to another. "My cousin in Billings says these Indian remedies are just snake oil and wishful thinking," came a skeptical male voice. "Then why are you here, Harvey Peterson?" the woman retorted, drawing scattered laughter. Walter returned after what seemed an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes. "I've spoken with a man who's helping organize the line," he said, climbing back onto the seat. "Told him we've come a long way and can't stay in town. He's agreed to let us see the healer next, though some folks aren't too happy about it." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Eliza said, squeezing his arm in gratitude. Walter guided her down from the wagon, one hand firmly supporting her elbow as they walked toward the creek. Eliza could hear the soft gurgle of water over rocks, smell the distinct musty scent of the riverbank mingled with tobacco smoke, and the herbal aromas emanating from what she assumed was the healer's tent. The crowd parted reluctantly, murmurs of displeasure mixing with expressions of sympathy, as Walter explained that the young lady had traveled far to see the medicine man. Eliza kept her face downturned, acutely aware of being the center of attention for the first time in her life. "The healer will see you now," a deep voice announced, and Eliza was led forward by Walter's steady hand. The tent smelled of sage, sweetgrass, and other herbs Eliza couldn't identify. The temperature was noticeably warmer inside, and the sounds of the crowd outside became muffled, creating an atmosphere of intimate seclusion. "Please sit," said a voice unlike any Eliza had heard before. It was deep and resonant, with an accent that shaped English words in a subtly different manner, yet was perfectly clear and educated. Walter helped Eliza find a seat on what felt like a low stool. "My name is Daniel Running Bear," the voice continued. "And you are?" "Eliza Blackwood," she replied, lifting her face for the first time since entering town. A moment of silence followed, during which Eliza imagined the healer studying her face, noting her unfocused eyes. "You've been blind since birth," Daniel Running Bear said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "How did you know?" "Your eyes move differently than those who lost sight later in life," he explained. "And you carry yourself with the confidence of someone who has always navigated the world without sight, rather than the hesitation of those recently blinded." Eliza nodded, impressed by his observation. "Can you help me?" she asked, the question direct and unadorned. Another pause, longer this time. Eliza heard the rustle of fabric as the healer moved around the tent, the gentle clink of glass bottles, the soft whisper of what might have been feathers or dried leaves. "Your companion seems anxious," Daniel finally said. "Is there a reason for his concern?" Walter shifted uncomfortably beside her. "We need to return to the ranch before sundown," he explained gruffly. "Her father doesn't know we're here." "I see," Daniel said, and Eliza detected a note of understanding in his voice. "And who is her father?" "Jackson Blackwood," Walter replied, after a slight hesitation. The name seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying significance beyond what Eliza could interpret. "The cattle rancher," Daniel said thoughtfully. "I've heard his name mentioned in town, a man of considerable influence and specific views." "He keeps her hidden away," Walter said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I think her blindness is something to be ashamed of. Never let her off the ranch." Eliza felt a flush of embarrassment at having her circumstances laid bare before a stranger, but she recognized the necessity of Walter's candor. Time was precious, and the healer needed to understand the stakes. "May I examine your eyes, Miss Blackwood?" Daniel asked, his tone gentle but professional. "Yes," Eliza agreed, sitting straighter on the stool. Warm hands cupped her face with surprising gentleness, tilting it toward what she assumed was better light. Fingers gently lifted. Her eyelids, and she could sense the healer's face close to hers, studying what she had never been able to see herself. "Breathe normally," Daniel instructed as he continued his examination, occasionally making soft sounds of contemplation. After several minutes, he released her face and moved away. Eliza heard the sound of water being poured, followed by the clink of metal instruments being arranged. "Your condition is congenital," Daniel finally said. "The opacity of the lens, what white doctors call cataracts, is present from birth rather than developing with age, as is more common." "Can it be cured?" Walter asked, his usual stoicism giving way to cautious hope. "Not cured precisely," Daniel replied carefully, "but treated, yes, possibly." Eliza's heart quickened. "What kind of treatment?" "In my years of study at Pennsylvania Medical College, before I returned to my people's ways, I learned of surgical procedures for adult cataracts. They are delicate and not without risk. For congenital cataracts such as yours, the procedure would be even more complex." "You're a real doctor?" Walter asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I hold medical degrees from two worlds," Daniel replied without offense. "I studied Western medicine for 7 years before returning to learn the healing traditions of my ancestors. I find wisdom in both approaches." "And which approach would you use for Eliza?" Walter pressed. "Neither alone would be sufficient," Daniel said. "The surgical technique would need to be complemented by specific herbal treatments to prepare the beforehand and promote healing afterward. It's a combination I've used successfully 3 times before with similar conditions." Hope swelled in Eliza's chest, but reality quickly tempered it. "My father would never allow it," she said softly. "No," Daniel agreed. "Based on what I've heard of Jackson Blackwood, I suspect he would not." A heavy silence fell over the tent, broken only by the distant sounds of the waiting crowd outside and the gentle bubbling of what Eliza guessed was some concoction being heated over a small flame. "There is another possibility," Daniel finally said. "I will be traveling north to the Cheyenne Reservation after leaving Riverton. I stay there for several months during the summer, teaching traditional medicine to the younger generation and treating those who come seeking help. You could come there." "Impossible," Walter interjected. "The reservation is nearly 100 miles away. We couldn't possibly—" "I could run away," Eliza interrupted, the words spilling out before she could consider their implications. "I could find a way to reach the reservation." "Eliza!" Walter's shock was palpable. "Your father would turn the territory upside down looking for you. He'd have the marshal and half the county on horseback within hours." Unless he believed I was dead, Eliza said, the plan forming as she spoke. The river behind the ranch floods. Every spring. If he thought I'd fallen in, no. Walter's voice was firm. That's not a possibility I'm willing to consider. The deception would destroy him, regardless of his faults. Daniel cleared his throat softly. Perhaps there is a middle path, he suggested, a truth that might open the door to possibility. What do you mean? Eliza asked. I will write a letter for you to give to your father, Daniel said. It will explain your condition in medical terms he might respect, outline the treatment I propose, and extend an invitation for him to bring you to the reservation himself. I will appeal to him not as a Cheyenne healer, but as a formally educated physician with a specialty in ocular conditions. He'll never agree, Walter said flatly. Perhaps not, Daniel acknowledged. But this gives him the opportunity to make the right choice. Sometimes people need only to be shown a path they hadn't considered before. Eliza considered the proposal, weighing its merits against her desperate desire for change. Write this letter, she finally decided. I'll find a way to make him read it. Daniel moved away, and Eliza heard the scratch of pen on paper. While he wrote, he spoke in a low, soothing voice. The treatment would require you to stay at the reservation for at least 6 weeks, he explained. The first procedure would address the right eye, and once that has healed sufficiently, we would treat the left. The recovery between procedures is critical. Rushing would risk infection or other complications. And what are the chances of success? Walter asked. For partial restoration of sight, quite good, perhaps 7 in 10, Daniel replied honestly. For complete restoration, much lower, perhaps 3 in 10. But even partial sight would be a significant change for someone who has never seen at all. Even shadows would be a miracle, Eliza whispered. Daniel finished writing and folded the paper. Eliza heard the soft sound of wax being dripped, followed by the press of what she assumed was a seal. This contains my credentials, explanation of your condition, and details of the treatment, Daniel said, pressing the letter into her hands. I've also included directions to the reservation and the best time to arrive, should your father agree. Thank you, Eliza said, carefully tucking the letter into her pocket. What do I owe you for today's consultation? There is no charge, Daniel replied, but I would ask something of you if I may. What is it? Courage, he said simply. A courage to keep hoping, regardless of your father's initial response. The greatest medicine I can offer is the belief that change is possible. As Walter helped Eliza to her feet, Daniel placed something small and smooth in her palm, a polished stone of some kind. This is serpentine, he explained. My people believe it helps clear obstacles from one's path. Keep it with you as a reminder that even the most immovable barriers can sometimes be circumvented. Outside the tent, the waiting crowd had grown larger, their murmured conversations creating a buzz of anticipation. Walter guided Eliza quickly back to the wagon, anxious to begin the journey home before anyone recognized her or word of their visit somehow reached Jackson Blackwood ahead of them. As they pulled away from town, Eliza clutched both the letter and the serpentine stone, feeling for the first time in her life that the boundaries of her existence might not be as fixed as she had always believed. Whether through the healer's medicine or her own newfound determination, something fundamental had changed during those brief moments in Daniel Running Bear's tent. The journey back to Blackwood Ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired and what might yet come. The afternoon sun warmed Eliza's face as she rehearsed in her mind how she would approach her father with the letter and what arguments she might use to persuade him. They were within sight of the ranch house, though Eliza could only sense this from Walter's relief-filled sigh when the foreman finally broke the silence. "What will you do if he refuses?" he asked softly. Eliza's fingers closed around the serpentine stone in her pocket, drawing strength from its smooth surface. "Then I'll find another way," she replied with quiet determination. "Because today I discovered something important, Mr. Hayes." "What's that, Miss Eliza?" "The world is much larger than my father led me to believe, and I intend to see it, one way or another." By the time Walter guided the wagon into the barn, the western sky had begun to blush with the first hints of sunset. They had returned with barely an hour to spare before Jackson Blackwood was expected back from the north pasture. "Hurry now," Walter urged as he helped Eliza down from the seat. "Mrs. Sullivan will be fretting herself, wondering if we made it back in time." Indeed, the cook was waiting anxiously on the back porch, wringing her apron between work-worn hands. She rushed forward as they approached, enveloping Eliza in a brief, fierce hug before quickly releasing her and glancing nervously toward the north road. "Thank the Lord you're back," she whispered. "Any trouble in town?" "None," Walter assured her, leading both women into the kitchen. Though plenty of curious eyes, doubtful anyone recognized her, but word travels fast in Riverton. Mrs. Sullivan busied herself at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the kitchen with the rich aroma of beef and herbs. And the healer. What did he say? As Walter unsaddled and tended to Daisy, Eliza recounted her meeting with Daniel Running Bear, her fingers tracing the outline of the sealed letter in her pocket as she spoke. Mrs. Sullivan listened intently, her wooden spoon occasionally tapping against the pot's edge to mark a particularly significant detail. "Cataracts," the older woman mused when Eliza finished. "My grandmother had those in her old age, never knew a child could be born with them." "Daniel, Dr. Running Bear, said it's uncommon but not unheard of," Eliza explained. "And he believes they can be treated with surgery." Mrs. Sullivan's voice carried a note of apprehension. "That's a fearsome prospect, child." "More fearsome than a lifetime of darkness," Eliza countered. Before Mrs. Sullivan could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats signaled the approach of riders. Her face paled. "They're back early. Quickly now, change out of that dress before your father sees you all done up with nowhere to have been." Eliza hurried to her room, changing from her blue dress into a simple brown one she typically wore around the house. She had just finished buttoning it when she heard her father's voice in the kitchen, gruffer than usual, demanding to know if Walter had returned from the south pasture. Mrs. Sullivan's reply was muffled, but whatever she said prompted heavy footsteps to approach Eliza's bedroom door. A sharp knock followed. "Eliza, are you decent?" "Yes, father," she called, hastily tucking the letter deeper into the pocket of her discarded blue dress and folding it away. The door opened, and Jackson Blackwood's distinctive scent of tobacco, leather, and the outdoors filled the room. "Mrs. Sullivan says you've been unwell today. A headache?" "Yes," Eliza lied, hating the deception but knowing the truth would have to wait until she had formulated the right approach. "But I'm feeling better now." "Good," Jackson said, and she could hear the distracted quality in his voice that suggested his mind was elsewhere. "There's trouble brewing. I need to ride into town tomorrow morning." Eliza's heart skipped. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" Jackson sighed heavily, and the bed creaked as he sat on its edge, a rare intimacy that signaled something truly significant. "Word came while we were moving the herd. There's an Indian who set up some kind of medicine show in Riverton. Been filling people's heads with nonsense about miracle cures." "Why is that trouble for us?" Eliza asked carefully, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "Because he's drawing crowds, and crowds mean my cattle drive next week will have to navigate around gawkers and fools with their wagons clogging the road. To town." Jackson's voice sharpened with irritation. "Mayor Parker should have run him off immediately, not given him leave to stay a week." Eliza's mind raced. This unexpected development could either ruin everything or provide the perfect opportunity. She took a steadying breath. "Father, I've heard that some of these healers actually have medical training, she ventured. Mrs. Sullivan mentioned it once, that some Indians go east to study medicine before returning to their tribes. A skeptical grunt was Jackson's only response. Perhaps this one is legitimate, she pressed. Have you considered that possibility? What concern is yours? Jackson asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Since when do you take an interest in town affairs? I take an interest in everything outside these walls, Eliza said, a rare note of defiance creeping into her voice. Just because I can't see the world doesn't mean I don't wonder about it. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, filled with all the conversations they had never had and the emotional distance that had grown too vast to easily bridge. Well, Jackson finally said, his tone softening slightly, wonder all you like, but this healer fellow will be gone by week's end, and things will return to normal in Riverton. As he rose to leave, Eliza made a split-second decision. Father. Wait, there's something I need to tell you. Jackson paused at the door. What is it? I went to town today, she said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. Walter took me. I met the healer. The silence that followed was so absolute that Eliza could hear the ticking of the mantel clock all the way from the parlor. When Jackson finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but threaded with the dangerous calm that was far more frightening than shouting would have been. You did what? I asked Walter to take me to town to see the Cheyenne healer, Eliza repeated, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. His name is Daniel Running Bear, and he's a qualified physician who studied at Pennsylvania Medical College. Walter. The single word contained multitudes of betrayal. Jackson's boots struck the floorboards with sharp authority as he strode from the room, calling for the foreman. Eliza followed as quickly as she dared, counting steps and using her outstretched hands to navigate the familiar path to the kitchen where she knew Walter would be. She arrived to find a confrontation already in progress. 15 years of loyalty, Jackson was saying, his voice taut with rage, and you repay me by going behind my back, taking my daughter into town without permission? It wasn't like that, Mr. Blackwood, Walter replied, his tone respectful but resolute. The girl deserves a chance to see a doctor about her condition. She's never even been examined, not properly. That was my decision to make, Jackson thundered. Mine, not yours, not hers. No, Father, Eliza interjected from the doorway. It's my life, my eyes, my future. The decision should have been mine all along. The kitchen fell silent, save for Jackson's heavy breathing. Eliza could sense Mrs. Sullivan nearby, likely frozen in place by the unfolding drama. He examined my eyes, Eliza continued into the silence. He says I have congenital cataracts that might be treatable with surgery. He wrote you a letter explaining everything. She held out her hand, realizing too late that she had left the letter in her other dress. It's in my blue dress pocket. He outlines the procedure, the risks, the potential outcomes. Enough. Jackson's voice had gone cold. Walter, you're dismissed from your position. Pack your things and be off my property by morning. Mr. Blackwood, please, Mrs. Sullivan began. And you, Jackson turned to her, were you part of this conspiracy too? I only wanted what was best for the child, Mrs. Sullivan said quietly. Then you can join Walter on the road tomorrow. I won't have disloyalty under my roof. Father, stop, Eliza cried. This isn't their fault. It was my idea, my plan. If you want to punish someone, punish me. Go to your room, Eliza, Jackson ordered. We'll discuss your behavior when I've dealt with this matter. I won't go, Eliza said, surprising herself with her defiance. Not until you agree to read the letter, not until you at least consider the possibility that this healer might actually be able to help me. There's nothing to consider, Jackson said dismissively. These so-called healers are charlatans, preying on desperate people with false hope. Like me, Eliza challenged. Am I desperate, Father? And if I am, who made me so? Who kept me locked? away from doctors, from help, from any chance at a normal life. The kitchen filled with a tension so thick it seemed to press against Eliza's skin. No one had ever spoken to Jackson Blackwood this way, certainly not his obedient, quiet daughter. She could almost feel the shock radiating from everyone present. "I did what I thought was best," Jackson finally said, his voice oddly subdued. "I was protecting you." "From what?" Eliza asked, gentler now. "From hope? From possibility? Or from your own discomfort with my condition?" She heard her father's sharp intake of breath, followed by the scrape of a chair as he sat heavily. For a long moment, the only sound was the bubbling of Mrs. Sullivan's neglected stew and the soft crackle of the kitchen fire. "The letter," Jackson finally said. "Where is it?" "In my room," Eliza replied. "In the pocket of my blue dress." "Mrs. Sullivan, fetch it," Jackson ordered, though without his earlier heat. "Walter, you may stay the night. We'll discuss your position in the morning when cooler heads prevail." Mrs. Sullivan hurried from the room, returning moments later with the sealed letter. Eliza heard the rustle of paper as her father broke the wax seal and unfolded it, followed by several minutes of silence as he read its contents. "Pennsylvania Medical College," Jackson muttered eventually. "Graduated with honors, it says here. Specialized training in ophthalmic conditions under Dr. William Thompson in Philadelphia." He cleared his throat. "This is surprising. Detailed." "What else does it say?" Eliza prompted. "He believes your condition, congenital cataracts, can be treated with a combination of surgical technique and herbal medicines to assist in healing," Jackson summarized. "The procedure would be performed at the northern Cheyenne reservation, where he maintains a proper medical facility. The recovery would require 6 to 8 weeks of careful monitoring." "And the chances of success?" Walter asked. Jackson paused before answering. "He suggests a 70% chance of partial restoration of sight, 30% for more complete results." Another pause. "He also notes the risks, infection being the primary concern, along with the possibility of the procedure failing. To produce any improvement, but even a partial restoration would be miraculous," Mrs. Sullivan interjected. "Imagine, Eliza, being able to see shapes, movement, light and dark." "I've been imagining it all day," Eliza said softly. "Ever since he told me it might be possible." Jackson folded the letter with deliberate precision. The chair creaked as he stood. "I need time to consider this," he said, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. "We'll discuss it tomorrow." His footsteps retreated toward his study, followed by the firm click of the door closing. The kitchen remained silent until Walter let out a long breath. "Well," he said, "that went better than I expected. At least we're not all sleeping in the barn tonight." "Will he agree?" Eliza asked anxiously. "What do you think, Mrs. Sullivan? You know him better than anyone." The cook sighed. "Your father is a proud man, child, stubborn as an oak, but he loves you in his way. I think you surprised him today, made him see you differently. As someone with a mind of her own," Walter added, "might be exactly what he needed." "Go rest now," Mrs. Sullivan advised, gently squeezing Eliza's shoulder. "Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it, your father's decision." That night, sleep eluded Eliza entirely. She lay awake, fingers constantly returning to the serpentine stone Daniel had given her, tracing its smooth contours and drawing comfort from its solidity. Outside her window, an owl called mournfully into the darkness, its voice carrying through the still night air. Sometime after midnight, Eliza heard her father's heavy tread in the hallway. It paused outside her door, and for a moment she thought he might enter, but after a long silence the footsteps continued on to his own room. Dawn arrived with the cheerful obliviousness of a new day, unaware of human dilemmas. Eliza dressed. Carefully, choosing her blue dress again, a small act of defiance and determination. Today would be different. Today, everything might change. She made her way to the dining room where breakfast was traditionally served, counting steps and trailing, her fingers along the familiar wallpaper. The scent of coffee and bacon told her Mrs. Sullivan had already been at work in the kitchen, despite the uncertainty of her continued employment. "Good morning, Father," she said, sensing his presence at the table before he spoke. "Eliza," he acknowledged. The rustle of the newspaper indicated he was reading, his normal morning routine, seemingly undisturbed by yesterday's revelations. She took her usual seat, and Mrs. Sullivan appeared moments later with a plate of eggs and bacon, setting it precisely where Eliza could find it. This daily courtesy, the quiet accommodations that made her blindness less limiting within these familiar walls, suddenly seemed both touching and insufficient. A life carefully arranged within boundaries versus a life potentially opened to new horizons. The clatter of Jackson folding his newspaper broke the silence. "I've been up most of the night," he said without preamble, "reading and rereading that letter, thinking about what you said." Eliza set down her fork, heart quickening. And I've written to Dr. Morrison in Helena," Jackson continued. "He's the finest physician in the territory. I've asked him to come examine you, to give a second opinion on this diagnosis and proposed treatment." Disappointment washed over Eliza. "You still don't believe the healer, Dr. Running Bear?" "I'm being cautious," Jackson corrected, as any father would be when considering allowing his daughter to undergo surgery in a reservation infirmary rather than a proper hospital. Hope flickered anew. He hadn't refused outright. "Does that mean you're considering it? Really considering it?" The table creaked as Jackson leaned forward. "Eliza, if there's even a remote possibility of improving your sight, of course I want that for you. I've only ever wanted what was best by hiding me away." The words escaped before she could temper them. Jackson's exhale was long and weighted with unspoken regrets. "I made mistakes," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "When you were born, and the doctor told us you would never see, your mother wanted to raise you just like any other child. I was the one who insisted on keeping you protected." "Protected," Eliza repeated softly. "Is that truly what you thought you were doing?" "At first, yes," Jackson said. "The world can be cruel to those who are different. But as time passed—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I think I was protecting myself as much as you, from the pitying looks, the whispered comments, from my own failure to accept that my daughter would never see the ranch I built, the cattle I raised, the sunsets over the mountains that I hoped to share with my children someday." The raw honesty in his voice stunned Eliza into silence. In all her 15 years, she had never heard her father speak so openly about his feelings. "After your mother died," he continued, "it became easier to maintain the status quo than to face change. I told myself you were safe here, content, that the world had nothing to offer you that could compare to the security of home. But it does." "Father," Eliza said gently, "it has everything to offer, and now possibly even sight." Another long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch work beginning outside, the clank of tools, the nickering of horses, calls between workers. "Dr. Morrison will be here within the week," Jackson finally said. "If he concurs with this Running Bear's assessment, and if he believes the proposed treatment has merit, then we will consider traveling to the reservation." Eliza reached across the table, finding her father's hand with uncanny accuracy. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's all I ask, that you consider it with an open mind." Jackson squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. "There's something else you should know," he said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. "I've rescinded Walter's dismissal. He was wrong to go behind my back, but his heart was in the right place, as was Mrs. Sullivan's. This household has seen enough loss without my pride adding to it." Relief flooded through Eliza. "They've been good to me," she said simply. "Both of them." "I know," Jackson acknowledged. "Better than I have been, perhaps." The admission hung in the air between them, not quite an apology, but the closest Jackson Blackwood had likely come to one in decades. "Now," he said, rising from the table, "I have ranch business to attend to, and you should finish your breakfast before Mrs. Sullivan scolds us both." As his footsteps receded, Eliza sat quietly, absorbing the momentous shift that had occurred. Nothing was certain yet. Dr. Morrison's examination, her father's final decision, the success of any eventual treatment, but possibility had entered her world like a shaft of sunlight through a long-shuttered window. Outside, a meadowlark sang its bright, complex melody, a sound Eliza had always loved. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine not just hearing the bird, but seeing its yellow breast and black collar, its flight across the blue Montana sky. The image, though born entirely of descriptions she'd been given, filled her with a longing so intense it was almost painful. She slipped her hand into her pocket, fingers finding the serpentine stone. "The greatest medicine I can offer is the belief that change is possible," Daniel Running Bear had told her. In the quiet of the morning, with the first real hope she had ever known warming her like the sun on her face, Eliza finally allowed herself to believe. The following days at Blackwood Ranch unfolded with an air of anticipation that seemed to permeate every corner of the household. Mrs. Sullivan took to humming as she worked in the kitchen, something Eliza hadn't heard since before her mother's death. Walter went about his duties with renewed purpose, and even the ranch hands, who knew nothing of the recent developments, commented on the change in atmosphere. "Like spring coming after a long winter," one of them remarked to another within Eliza's hearing as they passed the porch where she sat. For Jackson, the waiting manifested as restless energy. He rode the boundaries of his property daily, inspecting fences that didn't need inspecting and checking cattle that were perfectly healthy. When at home, he spent hours in his study, the scratch of his pen on paper occasionally drifting through the partially open door as he attended correspondence and ranch accounts with unusual diligence. Eliza herself found the waiting almost unbearable. Each morning she woke with the question foremost in her mind: would today be the day Dr. Morrison arrived? Each night she fell asleep clutching the serpentine stone, its smooth surface a talisman of hope. On the fourth day after their conversation, the distant sound of an approaching carriage sent the entire household into motion. Mrs. Sullivan rushed to put on a fresh pot of coffee, while Walter hurried to the front of the house to greet the visitor. Jackson emerged from his study, his boots striking the floorboards with purpose as he joined the foreman outside. Eliza remained in the parlor, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop their trembling. This moment, she realized, was pivotal. Dr. Morrison's assessment could either open the door to possibility or slam it firmly shut. The front door opened, bringing with it the sounds of male voices, her father's familiar rumble, Walter's respectful responses, and a new voice, cultured and precise with a slight Eastern accent. "Dr. Morrison, thank you for coming on such short notice," Jackson was saying as they entered the house. "I appreciate you making the journey from Helena." "Your letter made it clear the matter was urgent," the doctor replied, "and I admit I'm most intrigued by this case you've described." Footsteps approached the parlor, and Eliza straightened her posture, smoothing her dress with suddenly damp palms. "My daughter, Eliza," Jackson announced from the doorway. "Eliza, this is Dr. Abraham Morrison from Helena." "Miss Blackwood," the doctor greeted her, "a pleasure to make your acquaintance." "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Morrison," Eliza replied, turning her face toward his voice. "Thank you for traveling so far." "Not at all," he said, and Eliza heard him set something heavy on the side table, a medical bag, she presumed. Your father's letter described a most unusual situation. I've treated many cases of cataracts in my practice, but congenital cases are relatively rare, and the treatment proposal from this Cheyenne physician is unorthodox, to say the least. But not impossible? Eliza asked, unable to keep the hope from her voice. In medicine, very few things are truly impossible, Dr. Morrison replied diplomatically. May I examine you now? I'd like to form my own assessment before discussing the proposed treatment further. Of course, Eliza agreed. I'll have Mrs. Sullivan bring refreshments, Jackson said. Take all the time you need, Doctor. As her father's footsteps receded, Eliza heard the doctor open his bag, followed by the metallic clink of instruments being arranged on the table. I understand you've been blind since birth, Dr. Morrison said conversationally as he prepared. Have you ever been examined by an ophthalmologist before? No, Eliza replied. You're the first, aside from Dr. Running Bear. The doctor murmured, a note of disapproval in the sound. Quite remarkable considering your family's resources. Most parents would have sought multiple opinions for such a condition. Eliza remained silent, unwilling to criticize her father to this stranger, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. Now then, Dr. Morrison continued briskly, I'm going to examine your eyes with several instruments. Some may feel slightly uncomfortable, but nothing should cause pain. Please inform me immediately if you experience any discomfort. What followed was the most thorough examination Eliza had ever experienced. The doctor used instruments to hold her eyelids open, peered into her eyes with what he called an ophthalmoscope, and tested her ability to perceive light by passing a small lamp before her eyes from various angles. Interesting, he murmured several times, more to himself than to Eliza. Most interesting. After nearly 30 minutes, she heard him packing away his instruments. I've completed my examination, he announced. I'd like to discuss my findings with both you and your father, if that's agreeable. Yes, please, Eliza said, relief washing over her that the examination was finally complete. Jackson was summoned, and Eliza heard him enter the parlor with Mrs. Sullivan, who set a tray on the table before quietly withdrawing. Coffee, Doctor? Jackson offered. Thank you, Dr. Morrison replied, and there was a brief interlude of cups clinking against saucers before he continued. Mr. Blackwood, after examining your daughter, I can confirm that she does indeed have congenital cataracts in both eyes. The opacity is significant, but not total. Meaning? Jackson prompted. Meaning that with proper surgical intervention there is indeed a possibility of restoring some degree of vision, the doctor explained. I've reviewed the letter from Dr. Running Bear, and while his proposed method combines elements unfamiliar to Western medicine, the surgical technique he describes is fundamentally sound. Eliza's heart soared at these words, but she forced herself to remain still, waiting for the doctor to continue. In a proper hospital in Boston or New York, I would estimate the chance of success, defined as partial restoration of sight, at approximately 50 to 60%, Dr. Morrison continued. Dr. Running Bear's estimate of 70% seems optimistic, but not entirely unreasonable if his herbal preparations do indeed reduce inflammation and infection as he claims. And the risks? Jackson asked, his voice taut with concern. The primary risks are infection, which could potentially spread beyond the eye, and the possibility that the procedure might fail to improve vision at all, Dr. Morrison replied candidly. There is also a small risk, perhaps 5%, that complications could necessitate removal of the eye entirely, though Dr. Running Bear's surgical approach seems designed specifically to minimize this possibility. A heavy silence fell over the room as Jackson absorbed this information. Eliza could almost feel her father weighing the potential benefits against the risks, his natural caution battling with hope. If Eliza were your daughter, Jackson finally asked, would you permit this procedure? The doctor took his time answering, and Eliza heard him sip his coffee before setting the cup down with deliberate care. "Mr. Blackwood, if she were my daughter, I would have sought treatment years ago," he said, his tone gentle but uncompromising. "But to answer your question directly, yes, given the potential benefit and what appears to be Dr. Running Bear's considerable expertise, I would consent to the procedure, even at a reservation clinic rather than a city hospital," Jackson pressed. "The reservation is actually advantageous in one respect," Dr. Morrison noted. "The recovery period is critical, and having the surgeon continuously available for monitoring reduces certain risks. In the city hospital, your daughter would likely be one of many patients under a surgeon's care." Eliza held her breath, sensing her father's internal struggle, even without being able to see his face. "What about traveling to Helena instead?" Jackson suggested. "Surely you could perform this surgery." "I could," Dr. Morrison acknowledged. "But I must be honest with you. I've performed this procedure only 3 times in my career, all on elderly patients with age-related cataracts. Dr. Running Bear's letter indicates he has specific experience with congenital cases, which present unique challenges. In medicine, Mr. Blackwood, expertise often trumps proximity or familiarity." Another silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of ranch life continuing outside, oblivious to the momentous decision being contemplated within these walls. "There's one other factor to consider," Dr. Morrison added after a moment. "Your daughter is 15 now, but with each passing year, the chances of successful treatment diminish slightly. The brain's ability to adapt to new visual input is most flexible in youth. You're saying it's now or never," Jackson said flatly. "Not quite so stark," the doctor amended. "But certainly now rather than later would be my recommendation." Eliza couldn't contain herself any longer. "Father," she said, turning toward where she knew he sat, "please, I understand there are risks, but the possibility of seeing, even partially, it's worth any risk to me." "You say that now," Jackson replied, his voice tight with emotion, "but you've never known pain, never faced the possibility of losing what little you have." "I've lost plenty," Eliza countered, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I've lost the chance to see the ranch you love so much, to know what my mother looked like, to read books without relying on others. I've lost 15 years of a normal life because you were too afraid to seek help for me." The words hung in the air, sharper than she had intended, but true nonetheless. Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware he was witnessing a deeply personal exchange. "Perhaps," the doctor ventured carefully, "I should step outside for a moment to give you both privacy to discuss." "No," Jackson interrupted. "Stay, doctor. Your expertise is valuable." He drew a deep breath. "Eliza, you're right. I've let fear guide my decisions for too long. Fear of losing you like I lost your mother. Fear of seeing you hurt or disappointed if treatments failed. Maybe even fear of change itself." "So what now?" Eliza asked softly. "Now," Jackson said, his tone firm with resolve, "we make arrangements to visit this Dr. Running Bear. He emphasized, if after meeting him and seeing his clinic I still believe the procedure is reasonably safe, we'll proceed with the treatment." Joy coursed through Eliza so intensely that for a moment she couldn't speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Father." "Don't thank me yet," Jackson cautioned. "I haven't agreed to the surgery itself, only to meeting this doctor and evaluating his facility." "That's more than enough for now," Eliza assured him, recognizing the monumental step her father had just taken. After 15 years of isolation, the door to the outside world was finally cautiously opening. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "If I may, Mr. Blackwood, I'd be willing to correspond with Dr. Running Bear before your visit. Physician to physician, as it were. It might help. Establish a clearer understanding of his methods and facilities." "I would appreciate that," Jackson agreed. And your bill for today's consultation, consider it a professional courtesy, Dr. Morrison interrupted. This case is of significant medical interest. I only ask that you keep me informed of the outcome, whatever you decide. The remainder of the doctor's visit passed in discussion of practical matters, the journey to the reservation, accommodations, supplies they would need for an extended stay. Through it all, Eliza sat quietly, her mind racing ahead to possibilities she had never dared contemplate before. After Dr. Morrison departed, with promises to write soon with any additional information he gathered about Dr. Running Bear, the house settled into an atmosphere of cautious excitement. Mrs. Sullivan immediately began planning provisions for a long journey, while Walter volunteered to accompany them and handle the practical aspects of travel. That evening, as Eliza sat on the porch enjoying the cool evening breeze, she heard her father's approaching footsteps. He settled into the chair beside her with a weary sigh. "It's a beautiful sunset tonight," he said after a moment. "Skies all painted with purple and gold, with the mountains standing dark against it." Eliza smiled, recognizing this for what it was, his way of sharing something he hoped she might soon see for herself. "Tell me more," she encouraged. "There's a single star out already, bright as a diamond against the deepening blue." Jackson continued, his voice softening. "When you were very small, before you could talk, I used to carry you out here in the evenings. You'd reach your tiny hands up toward the stars like you were trying to grab them." "I don't remember that," Eliza said, touched by this glimpse into a time before the walls of isolation had been built around her. "Your mother would scold me for keeping you up past your bedtime." Jackson chuckled. "But I'd tell her you needed to know the stars, even if you couldn't see them." They sat together in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, each lost in private thoughts about the journey that lay ahead, both the physical trip to the reservation and the more profound journey toward healing, not just of Eliza's eyes, but of the family itself. "Father," Eliza finally said, "I've been thinking about something Dr. Running Bear told me." "What's that?" "He said the greatest medicine he could offer was the belief that change is possible," she explained. "I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I think I do now." "And what do you think he meant?" Jackson asked. "That sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the physical process itself, but opening ourselves to the possibility that things could be different," Eliza said thoughtfully. "For both of us, that might be the most difficult part of this journey." Jackson's hand found hers in the darkness, rough and calloused from years of ranch work, but gentle in its touch. "You've grown wise beyond your years, daughter," he said, softly. "Wiser than your old father, certainly." "I've had a lot of time to think," Eliza replied with a small smile. "Not much else to do when you're kept away from the world." Instead of bristling at the gentle rebuke, Jackson squeezed her hand. "That changes now," he promised. "Whether this treatment succeeds or fails, that changes now." A week later, preparations for the journey were complete. Walter had arranged for a comfortable traveling wagon with good springs to ease the journey over rough terrain. Mrs. Sullivan had packed provisions sufficient for the extended stay, including special treats she knew Eliza favored. Jackson had written ahead to Dr. Running Bear, informing him of their impending arrival and confirming accommodations would be available near the clinic. The night before their departure, Eliza sat alone in her room, running her fingers over the small collection of treasures on her windowsill. The stones, feathers and dried flowers Walter had brought her over the years, tangible connections to the world beyond her reach. Among them now sat the serpentine stone, smooth and cool against her fingertips. Tomorrow she would leave the only home she had ever known, venturing into a world she had experienced solely through others' descriptions. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. "It's me," Mrs. Sullivan said, entering the room with the rustle of fabric that suggested she carried something bulky. I have something for you. To take on your journey. What is it? Eliza asked, curious. A quilt, Mrs. Sullivan explained, placing it in Eliza's outstretched hands. The fabric felt soft and worn in places, clearly not new. It belonged to your mother. She made it before you were born, when she was expecting you. I found it packed, away in the attic when I was looking for traveling blankets. Eliza ran her hands over the quilt, feeling the intricate patterns of stitching, the varied textures of different fabrics pieced together. What does it look like? She asked, her voice hushed with emotion. It's beautiful, Mrs. Sullivan said warmly. Each square tells a story. There's fabric from your grandmother's wedding dress, from your father's first Sunday suit, from the curtains that hung in your parents' first small cabin before this house was built. And in the center, there's an embroidered heart with the words, "For our child, with love that knows no bounds." Tears welled in Eliza's sightless eyes. She made this for me? She worked on it every evening for months, Mrs. Sullivan confirmed. Said she wanted you to be wrapped in family history and love, no matter what life brought. Eliza clutched the quilt to her chest, breathing in its faint scent of cedar from storage, and beneath that, perhaps the lingering ghost of her mother's perfume. "Thank you for finding this," she whispered. "It feels like she's giving me her blessing for this journey." "She would have been the first to seek help for your eyes," Mrs. Sullivan said gently. "She would be proud of your courage now." After the cook had left, Eliza carefully folded the quilt and placed it atop her packed trunk. Whatever the coming weeks might bring, success or disappointment, sight or continued darkness, she would face it wrapped in this tangible reminder of love that had preceded her birth and would sustain her through whatever lay ahead. Outside, her window, an owl called into the night, its voice carrying across the valley. Eliza listened, committing to memory the sounds of home, the creaking of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Soon, these familiar sounds would be replaced by new ones, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would be accompanied by sights she had only imagined. As she drifted towards sleep, her hand closed around the serpentine stone one last time. "Change is possible," she murmured to herself. Tomorrow she would begin discovering just how possible it might be. Dawn broke clear and cool over Blackwood Ranch as the small party prepared for departure. Walter secured the last of their trunks to the traveling wagon, while Mrs. Sullivan fussed over final provisions, packing extra biscuits and dried apple slices for the road. Jackson stood on the porch, giving last-minute instructions to Foreman Davis, who would oversee the ranch in his absence. "Expect us back in 8 weeks, possibly 10 if the recovery takes longer than anticipated," Jackson was saying. "The cattle drive to Helena should proceed as scheduled. Wire me at Fort Keogh if any problems arise." "Yes, sir," Davis replied. "Don't you worry about things here. Just focus on getting Miss Eliza the help she needs." Eliza emerged from the house, one hand trailing along the porch railing for guidance, the other clutching her mother's quilt. The early morning air carried the scent of pine and dew-dampened earth, familiar smells that she committed to memory, knowing the landscape would soon change. "Ready, daughter?" Jackson asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "As ready as I'll ever be," Eliza replied with a small smile. Walter helped her into the wagon, where a nest of pillows and blankets had been arranged for her comfort during the long journey. Mrs. Sullivan tearfully pressed a package into her hands. "Ginger cookies for the trip," she explained, her voice thick with emotion, "and a letter to read to you each night before sleeping, one for each day you'll be gone." "You won't be reading them to me yourself?" Eliza asked, surprised. "Someone needs to keep this house running," Mrs. Sullivan replied. "Besides, my old bones aren't made for sleeping on the ground anymore." Eliza reached out, finding the cook's face and gently wiping away a tear. "I'll miss you," she whispered, but I'll have so much to tell you when I return." With final goodbyes exchanged, the small caravan set off, Jackson on his favorite stallion, Thunderbolt, Walter driving the wagon with Eliza, and two ranch hands, Billy and Samuel, riding alongside as protection against the rare but not unheard of possibility of bandits or hostile encounters. The first day's travel took them beyond the boundaries of Blackwood Ranch and into territory entirely new to Eliza. Though she couldn't see the changing landscape, she could feel the difference in the air as they descended from the foothills into the broad valley that led northward. The temperatures rose as the day progressed. A new scents filled the air: wild sage, sun-baked earth, and occasionally the sharp tang of alkali flats. "Tell me what you see," Eliza requested of Walter, just as she had during their secret journey to town. The foreman, more comfortable now in his role as narrator, described the landscape in vivid detail: the rolling grasslands dotted with prickly pear cactus, a distant herd of pronghorn antelope bounding away from their approach, a hawk circling lazily on thermals rising from the warming earth. Jackson, who rode ahead scouting the trail, occasionally dropped back to check on Eliza's comfort. During one such visit around midday, he announced they would stop for lunch beneath a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek. "How are you holding up?" he asked as he helped Eliza from the wagon. "Well enough," she replied, stretching stiff limbs. "Though I hadn't realized how vast the world is beyond our ranch. We've been traveling for hours, and Walter says we've barely begun the journey." "Montana's a big country," Jackson said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Takes a strong spirit to carve out a place in it." Eliza settled on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree, feeling the dappled sunlight warm on her face. "Did you always know you wanted to ranch here?" she asked, realizing how little she knew of her father's life before the ranch. Before, her Jackson was quiet for a moment, and Eliza heard him uncorking a canteen. "Not always," he finally said. "I was bound for California originally, back in '65 after the war. Had dreams of striking it rich in the gold fields." "What changed your mind?" "I came through this valley in early summer, much like now. The grass was belly-high on my horse. The streams were running clear and cold, and the mountains, well, they called to me something I didn't know was there." He paused, and Eliza could hear the smile in his voice as he continued. "I made camp, right about where Riverton sits now. That night, watching the sunset paint those mountains, I knew I'd found home." "And Mother? How did she come to be here?" Eliza asked, hungry for these stories that had rarely been shared. "Margaret came west as a schoolteacher the following year. She was assigned to the one-room schoolhouse in what was then just a cluster of cabins and a trading post. First time I saw her, she was reading poetry to a group of grubby ranch children. Gesturing so enthusiastically, she knocked over her water glass. Eliza laughed, treasuring this glimpse of the mother she barely remembered. "Did you fall in love right away?" "Not exactly," Jackson admitted with a chuckle. "She thought I was an uncultured roughneck, and I thought she was an impractical Easterner who wouldn't last a Montana winter. We were both partly right, I suppose." Their conversation was interrupted by Walter calling everyone to lunch. As they ate Mrs. Sullivan's cold chicken and biscuits, Eliza marveled at this new, more open version of her father. Perhaps the journey had already begun changing them both in ways that had nothing to do with her eyes. The party made camp that evening beside a small stream, having covered nearly 30 miles, a good pace that would bring them to the reservation in 3 more days if all went well. After a supper of beans and salt pork cooked over an open fire, Eliza asked Walter to read the first of Mrs. Sullivan's letters. "My dearest Eliza," Walter read, his weathered voice softening as he shared the cook's words. "Tonight, as you sleep, beneath strange stars, remember that some things remain constant no matter where you travel. The same moon that shines on Blackwood Ranch shines on you now. The same God who has watched over you all your life continues his vigilance. And the same love we all bear for you travels with you, as present as your own heartbeat. The letter continued with homely details of ranch life and memories of Eliza as a child, concluding with a simple prayer for healing and safe return. By the time Walter finished reading, the camp had fallen silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. "Thank you," Eliza said softly, clutching her mother's quilt around her shoulders against the evening chill. "I think I'll turn it in now." Jackson helped her to the tent that had been set up for her, a luxury the men would forego, sleeping instead under the vast canopy of stars. As he adjusted her blankets, his hand lingered briefly on her shoulder. "Sleep well, daughter," he said. "Tomorrow brings us another day closer." The journey continued at dawn, the landscape gradually changing as they traveled northward. Walter described how the rolling hills gave way to more dramatic buttes and mesas, the vegetation shifting from lush grassland to sparser, hardier plants, adapted to the harsher climate. On the afternoon of the third day, they encountered their first significant obstacle, a creek swollen with late spring runoff, its usual ford too deep for safe crossing. "We'll need to head east a few miles," Jackson decided after scouting both, upstream and down. "There's a narrower crossing where we might be able to fell a tree to bridge the gap." The detour cost them half a day's travel, but by sunset they had successfully crossed and were back on their northward route. That night, camped in the lee of a sandstone outcropping, Billy entertained them with his harmonica, while Samuel told tales of his grandfather, who had trapped beaver throughout the territory before white settlement. "He always said the land remembers," Samuel recounted, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller. "Every footstep, every campfire, every word spoken aloud, the land keeps these things, holding them like treasures in its rocky heart." "A poetic notion," Jackson commented, surprising Eliza with his receptiveness to such fanciful ideas. "More than notion, Mr. Blackwood," Samuel replied. "My people have always known that places have power. Some heal, some harm, some remember, some forget. The reservation we're headed to, it's on healing ground, has been since before time was counted." "You're Cheyenne?" Eliza asked, realizing she had never known this about the quiet ranch hand. "Quarter Cheyenne through my mother's side," Samuel. "Confirmed. Enough to know the old stories, not enough to live on the reservation. Caught between worlds, my grandfather used to say." This revelation cast their journey in a new light for Eliza. Samuel had been employed at Blackwood Ranch for 3 years, yet she had never before heard him speak of his heritage. Had her father's attitudes made him feel such topics were unwelcome? Or had her own isolation simply prevented the natural exchange of personal histories that might have occurred otherwise? The fourth day of travel brought them within sight of Fort Keogh, the military outpost that marked the boundary between settler territory and the northern Cheyenne reservation. Jackson decided they would spend the night at the fort, taking advantage of proper beds and hot baths before the final leg of their journey. The fort bustled with activity, soldiers drilling in the yard, wagons arriving with supplies, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against anvil. For Eliza, who had known only the relative quiet of the ranch, the cacophony was both overwhelming and exhilarating. "So many people," she marveled as Walter guided her through the busy compound toward the visitors' quarters. "How do you keep a track of who's who?" "Most folks rely on their eyes," Walter replied with gentle humor, "but I reckon you've got other ways of knowing." Indeed, Eliza found herself cataloguing the distinct cadence of footsteps, the varied timbres of voices, the personal sense that identified individuals as surely as faces might have. By the time they sat down to supper in the fort's mess hall, she could distinguish between several of the officers who joined them at table. Major Harrison. she said confidently, when a deep voice inquired about their destination. "You're the one with the pocket watch that ticks slightly faster than the wall clock." "Impressive observation, Miss Blackwood," the Major replied. Genuine admiration in his tone. Most people with full sight miss details far more obvious. When one sense is diminished, others compensate, Jackson explained, and Eliza heard a note of pride in his voice that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. After supper, Major Harrison drew Jackson aside for a private conversation that Eliza couldn't help overhearing as they stood near her seat. "This Cheyenne. Healer you're going to see, Running Bear. I've met him," the Major said. "Remarkable man. Treated one of my lieutenants for a saber wound that our post surgeon had given up as fatal. The lieutenant's back on active duty now." "You sound surprised," Jackson observed. "I admit I was skeptical at first," Harrison replied. "Army policy hasn't exactly encouraged us to view the natives as equals, much less as superior in any field. But medicine often transcends such prejudices out of necessity. Results speak for themselves." This unexpected endorsement seemed to ease some of Jackson's lingering reservations. When he helped Eliza to her room later that evening, his mood was lighter than it had been since their departure. "Sleep well," he told her. "Tomorrow we reach the reservation, and you'll meet this healer who's inspired such a journey." "Are you still afraid?" Eliza asked directly. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he finally admitted, "but I'm beginning to think that fear has been my poorest counsel all these years." The final day's journey took them across the invisible boundary that separated government land from the reservation. The landscape itself gave no indication of this political division, but Eliza sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Perhaps in the way the men spoke, or in the tension that crept into her father's posture as they traveled deeper into what he considered foreign territory. Around midday, they encountered a young Cheyenne man on horseback who introduced himself as Joseph, Eagle Feather, Dr. Running Bear's assistant. He had been sent to guide them the remaining distance to the clinic. "Dr. Running Bear received your letter and has prepared accommodations for your stay," Joseph explained as he fell in alongside Jackson. "He asks that you come directly to the clinic upon arrival, so he can begin his assessment before the day's light fades." The clinic, when they finally reached it in late afternoon, proved far more substantial than Jackson had apparently expected. Eliza heard his small intake of breath as Joseph described the facility. The main building was once the Indian Agency headquarters, built of stone, with proper windows and wooden floors, Joseph explained. Dr. Running Bear converted it 5 years ago after returning from his studies in the East. The recovery wards are in the adjoining structure and his personal quarters are behind. As they drew to a stop, Eliza heard the sounds of activity, children playing nearby, women's voices calling to one another, the rhythmic chopping of firewood. This was no isolated outpost, but a living community. "Welcome to Healing Waters." A familiar voice called, and Eliza recognized Daniel Running Bear immediately. "You've made good time. I didn't expect you for another day at least." "The journey was uneventful," Jackson replied, his tone carefully neutral. "My daughter was eager to arrive." Eliza felt herself being helped down from the wagon, and then Daniel's hand was clasping hers in greeting. "Miss Blackwood, I'm pleased you convinced your father to make this journey." "As am I," she replied warmly, "though I believe Dr. Morrison's endorsement carried more weight than my arguments." "Ah, yes, Dr. Morrison, a fine physician. He wrote to me with several insightful questions about the procedure." Daniel turned his attention to Jackson. "Mr. Blackwood, I know you must have concerns. I hope to address them all during your stay with us." "I'm here, aren't I?" Jackson said gruffly. "That should tell you I'm willing to listen." "More than listen." "I hope," Daniel replied evenly. "But first you must be tired from your journey. Joseph will show you to your accommodations. We've prepared the guest cabin for your use. It's simple but comfortable, with a proper stove and beds. Once you've refreshed yourselves, perhaps you'd join me for a tour of the clinic?" The guest cabin proved indeed basic, but clean and welcoming. A fire had been laid in the small iron stove, and fresh bedding adorned the two narrow cots. A water basin with clean towels stood on a side table, and a bunch of wildflowers in a clay jar graced the windowsill. "Not what I expected," Eliza heard her father mutter as he deposited their bags. "What did you expect?" she asked genuinely. "Curious, I'm not sure," he admitted. "Something more primitive, I suppose." After washing away the dust of travel, they made their way to the clinic, where Daniel was waiting to show them around. He led them through a series of rooms, an examination area with surprisingly modern medical equipment, a surgical suite with large windows to provide optimal light, recovery wards with clean, comfortable beds, and a dispensary filled with both conventional medicines and traditional herbal preparations. "Most of my surgical instruments came with me from Philadelphia," Daniel explained as they toured. "The microscope is particularly important for the cataract procedures, allowing for precision that would be impossible with the naked eye." "And the herbs?" Jackson asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. "What role do they play?" "Prevention and healing," Daniel replied without defensiveness. "Western medicine excels at intervention, cutting, removing, repairing. Indigenous medicine offers complementary strengths in preparing the body beforehand and supporting natural healing afterward. The combination produces better outcomes than either approach alone." As the tour concluded, Daniel invited them to dine with him that evening, in his personal quarters. "We can discuss the proposed treatment in detail, answer any questions you have, and if you feel comfortable proceeding, begin preliminary preparations tomorrow." "So soon?" Jackson asked, startled. "The procedure itself wouldn't take place for at least a week," Daniel clarified. "Eliza would need to take specific herbal preparations daily to reduce inflammation and prepare her eyes. This gives us time for more thorough examination and for you to observe other patients recovering from similar procedures." "There are others here with the same condition?" Eliza asked hopefully. "Currently, yes. A 12-year-old boy from the Crow Reservation to the west. His procedure was performed 2 weeks ago on his right eye with encouraging results. He can distinguish between light and dark now and is beginning to perceive basic shapes and movement." Hope surged through Eliza with such intensity that her knees nearly buckled. Light and dark, shapes, movement. These simple perceptions that sighted people took for granted seemed miraculous possibilities after a lifetime of complete darkness. "May I meet him?" she asked eagerly. "Of course," Daniel agreed. "Tomorrow morning would be best, when the light is good for testing his progress." That evening, as they shared a simple but delicious meal of roasted venison and wild rice in Daniel's quarters, Jackson's questions came rapid fire, each probing for weakness in the healer's knowledge or approach. To Eliza's relief, Daniel answered, each with patience and precision, his medical training evident in his detailed explanations of the surgical technique, potential complications, and expected recovery process. "The procedure would address the right eye first," he explained. "A small incision at the edge of the cornea allows access to the clouded lens, which is then gently broken up and removed. In a typical cataract surgery, that would be the end. The patient would wear thick glasses afterward to compensate for the missing lens. But that's not what you propose for Eliza," Jackson noted. "No, for younger patients, particularly those with congenital cataracts, I use a technique I developed that combines Western surgical approaches with a traditional Cheyenne method involving fish membranes." "Fish membranes?" Jackson repeated skeptically. "The thin, transparent membrane that lines the swim bladder of certain fish," Daniel explained. "When properly prepared, it can be inserted to replace the removed lens. It's not perfect, the patient will still require glasses, but it provides a Better foundation for vision than removal alone. And this has been successful, Jackson pressed. In 7 of the 9 congenital cases I've treated, yes. 2 experienced complications. 1 developed an infection that resolved with treatment, though vision improvement was minimal. The other simply didn't respond as hoped, though there was still some improvement from the pre-surgical state. By the end of the evening, even Jackson seemed impressed by Daniel's knowledge and candor. As they walked back to their cabin, under a sky blazing with stars, Eliza sensed a shift in her father's attitude, from suspicious toleration to cautious respect. "What do you think?" she asked, once they were inside, the door closed against the cool night air. Jackson was quiet for so long that Eliza wondered if he would answer. Finally, he sighed deeply. I think he knows what he's doing," he admitted. "More than I expected, more than I hoped, if I'm being honest." "Then we'll proceed?" Eliza asked, hardly daring to believe. "We'll meet this crow boy tomorrow," Jackson said carefully. "See these results for ourselves. If what we find matches what Running Bear claims, then yes, we'll proceed." Eliza sat on her cot, fingers finding the serpentine stone in her pocket. After years of darkness, after a journey of hundreds of miles, after breaking through walls of fear and prejudice, she stood at the threshold of possibility. Tomorrow might bring the first step toward a world she had only experienced through others' descriptions, a world of light and color, shape and dimension. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, reaching out to find his hand in the darkness that might, just might, be coming to an end. Morning arrived at the reservation with a chorus of birdsong, unlike anything Eliza had heard before. A symphony of trills, calls, and warbles that seemed to celebrate the new day with unbridled enthusiasm. She lay still for several moments, simply absorbing the sounds and the gentle warmth of sunlight streaming through the cabin window. "Awake already?" Her father's voice came from the other cot, followed by the creak of the rope bed as he sat up. "The birds woke me," Eliza replied. "They're different here, more varied than at home." "This valley cradles several ecosystems," Jackson observed. "The river attracts species we don't see in the foothills." Eliza marveled at this casual acknowledgement of the natural world, something her father had rarely discussed with her before. This journey was changing him in subtle but significant ways, opening doors to conversations that had previously been closed. After a simple breakfast of corn cakes and dried berries provided by a young Cheyenne woman who introduced herself as Mary White Cloud, they made their way to the clinic where Daniel awaited them. The morning air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, mingled with something medicinal that Eliza couldn't identify. "Good morning," Daniel greeted them warmly. "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough," Jackson replied, his tone less guarded than it had been the previous day. "We're here to meet this crow boy you mentioned, the one who's had the procedure." "Yes, of course. Matthew is expecting you." Daniel led them through the clinic to a bright room that Eliza could sense was filled with morning light. "Matthew, these are the visitors I told you about. Miss Eliza Blackwood and her father." "Hello," came a young voice, slightly accented and vibrant with enthusiasm. "Are you going to get your eyes fixed too?" "I hope so," Eliza replied, instantly drawn to the boy's uninhibited manner. "Dr. Running Bear says you can see now?" "Some," Matthew confirmed. "Not like before I got sick. I wasn't born blind like you. I got the fever 2 years ago and after everything was dark. But now I can see light again and shadows moving. Dr. Running Bear says it will get better as my eye heals more." "May I?" Eliza asked, reaching out tentatively. Understanding her intention, Matthew guided her hand to his face. With gentle fingers, Eliza explored the contours around his right eye, feeling the slight puffiness that suggested recent surgery. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore," Matthew assured her. "It was sore for a few days, and I had to wear a covering." "To keep the light out," but now it just feels strange, like my eye is learning how to work again. Daniel explained that Matthew's condition had been different from Eliza's, cataracts resulting from illness rather than present from birth. But the surgical approach was similar. The main difference is that Matthew's brain remembers seeing, so it can more quickly interpret the visual information once the clouded lens is removed. And for Eliza, Jackson asked, her brain will need to learn what it has never known, Daniel acknowledged. That's why the fish membrane is particularly important in her case. It provides a clearer initial image, giving the brain better information to work with. The process may be slower, but the potential is still significant. At Jackson's request, Daniel conducted several tests to demonstrate Matthew's progress. He asked the boy to identify the location of a lamp being moved around the room, to distinguish between light and shadow by covering and uncovering a window, and to reach for objects placed before him. "Can you see color?" Eliza asked eagerly. "Not yet," Matthew admitted. "Everything is bright or dim, like moonlight makes the world. But Dr. Running Bear says colors might come later, especially after my other eye is fixed too." The demonstration lasted nearly an hour, with Jackson asking increasingly technical questions about the procedure, recovery process, and expected outcomes. Through it all, Matthew remained patiently cooperative, seeming to understand the importance of his role in helping Eliza gain approval for her own treatment. "Well, Mr. Blackwood," Daniel finally asked, as they prepared to leave Matthew to his rest, "do you have additional questions?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, his hand resting lightly on Eliza's shoulder. "I'd like to observe one of these procedures before making my final decision," he said finally, "to see exactly what my daughter would undergo." "That's a reasonable request," Daniel agreed readily. "As it happens, I have a cataract surgery scheduled tomorrow morning, an elderly woman from the reservation. With her permission, you could observe, and if I approve," Jackson continued, "how soon could Eliza's treatment begin?" "The preparatory herbs should be taken for 5 days before surgery," Daniel explained. "She could begin those today, and if all goes well with your observation tomorrow, we could schedule her procedure for the beginning of next week." Hope swelled in Eliza's chest, tempered only by the knowledge that her father's permission still hung in the balance. She had come so far, both literally and figuratively, but the final hurdle remained. "Let's proceed one step at a time," Jackson said cautiously. "I'll observe tomorrow's surgery, and we can discuss the next steps afterward." That afternoon, Daniel invited Eliza to join him in gathering some of the herbs that would be used in her pre-surgical preparation, if Jackson approved. With her father's somewhat reluctant permission, Eliza set off with the healer and his assistant Joseph, venturing into the hills surrounding the reservation. "The land here is particularly rich in medicinal plants," Daniel explained as they walked. "The combination of river valley, foothills, and protected southern slopes creates microclimates that support diverse species." Free from her father's watchful presence, Eliza found herself asking questions that had lingered since their first meeting in Riverton. "How did you come to combine two such different healing traditions?" she inquired, as they paused to gather some plant Joseph identified as echinacea. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I was raised in both worlds," he explained. "My father was a respected Cheyenne medicine man, and my mother the daughter of a Pennsylvania missionary. When I showed aptitude for healing, my father taught me the traditional ways, how to identify plants, prepare remedies, and understand the body's natural rhythms. He helped Eliza feel the distinctive, cone-shaped center of the echinacea flower, explaining how this particular plant strengthened the body's ability to fight infection. When I was 16, he continued. My mother's family offered to sponsor my education in the East. My father, showing wisdom that still humbles me, encouraged me to go, to learn the white man's medicine and bring that knowledge back to our people. Was it difficult? Eliza asked. Being caught between two worlds. At times extremely so, Daniel admitted. At medical college, some professors viewed my interest in traditional remedies as primitive superstition, and when I returned, some of my own people saw my Western training as a betrayal of our ways. But healing transcends such divisions. I believe the body doesn't care about the origin of what makes it well again. This perspective resonated deeply with Eliza, who had herself existed in a liminal space, neither fully part of the ranch household nor completely separate from it, neither accepted in the wider world nor truly hidden from it. The most powerful medicine, Daniel added as they continued their gathering, often comes from bridging divides that others believe cannot be crossed. By the time they returned to the clinic, laden with fresh herbs to be dried and prepared, Eliza felt a connection to Daniel that went beyond his role as her potential surgeon. He had walked between worlds, just as she hoped to, between darkness and light, between isolation and connection. That evening, after a simple dinner in their cabin, Jackson surprised Eliza by suggesting a walk around the reservation. I'd like to get a better sense of this place, he explained. See how these people live. As they strolled through the small community, Jackson described what he saw, the neat rows of cabins and traditional teepees, the communal gardens where women worked together, the children playing games in the twilight. Several residents greeted them respectfully, some in English and others in Cheyenne, with gestures that conveyed welcome. It's not what I expected, Jackson admitted, as they paused near the river that gave the settlement its name. What did you expect? Eliza asked, echoing her question from the previous day. More desperation, I suppose, more evidence of conquered people. The admission seemed to cost him something, revealing prejudices he might not have previously recognized in himself. Instead, I see a community adapting but maintaining its dignity, changing but not breaking. Like Matthew, Eliza suggested. Changed by circumstance, but finding a new way forward. Perhaps, Jackson agreed softly. They returned to their cabin in thoughtful silence, each contemplating the transformations occurring not just in their surroundings, but within themselves. The following morning brought clear skies and optimal conditions for the surgery Jackson would observe. After a brief breakfast, he left for the clinic while Eliza remained behind, too nervous to sit still, but prohibited from entering the surgical area. Walter, who had been busy establishing their camp and tending to the horses, suggested a diversion. Miss Eliza, would you care to visit the river? There's a nice spot with flat stones for sitting, and the sound is mighty peaceful. Grateful for the distraction, Eliza allowed Walter to guide her to the riverbank. The water's gentle murmur indeed had a calming effect, and the warm sun on her face helped ease the tension that had built in her shoulders. Walter, she said after they had sat in companionable silence for some time, do you think Father will allow the surgery? The foreman considered his words carefully. Your father is a proud man, Miss Eliza, admitting he might have been wrong all these years, keeping you away from doctors, from treatment. That's a mighty difficult thing for him. But watching the surgery today, do you think it will convince him? I've known Jackson Blackwood for 20 years, Walter replied, and in all that time, I've never seen him change his mind once it was set, until this journey. The fact that we're here at all suggests something fundamental has shifted in him. This perspective offered Eliza both hope and a deeper understanding of the internal struggle her father must be facing. His resistance wasn't merely stubbornness, but a complex tangle of fear, guilt, and the natural human reluctance to acknowledge a long-standing error in judgment. What will you do? Walter asked gently. If you can see, what's the first thing you want to look at? Eliza had considered this question often during the journey, but had never spoken her answer aloud. "My father's face," she said softly. "I want to see the man who's been only a voice and hands and footsteps to me for 15 years. I want to know if his expression matches his tone when he's pleased or angry or sad. I want to see if I look like him or like my mother." Walter cleared his throat, clearly moved by her response. "Well," he said gruffly, "I reckon that's worth fighting for." They remained by the river until midday, when Joseph came to inform them that the surgery had been completed successfully and Jackson had returned to their cabin. Eliza's heart raced as Walter guided her back, each step bringing her closer to her father's decision. She found Jackson sitting outside the cabin, his face turned toward the sun. "Father," she ventured cautiously. "Eliza," he acknowledged, his voice unreadable. "How was the surgery?" she asked, settling onto the bench beside him. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note of wonder that Eliza had never heard before. "It was extraordinary. The precision, the care, the obvious expertise. Running Bear works with the steady hands of an artist and the confidence of someone who has performed this procedure many times." Hope bloomed in Eliza's chest. And I've given him permission to begin your preparatory treatment today," Jackson said simply. "The surgery will be scheduled for 5 days from now, assuming all goes well with the preliminary steps." Joy surged through Eliza with such force that she found herself speechless, capable only of reaching for her father's hand and squeezing it tightly. Jackson returned the pressure, his calloused palm warm against hers. "There are no guarantees," he cautioned, ever practical. Running Bear was very clear about that. The procedure might not work as hoped, or complications could arise. "I understand," Eliza assured him, "but the possibility alone is worth the risk." That afternoon, Daniel began Eliza's preparatory treatment with a thorough examination of her eyes, confirming his initial diagnosis and making detailed notes about the specific characteristics of her cataracts. He then prescribed a regimen of herbal teas and compresses to be applied 3 times daily. "These will reduce inflammation and prepare your eyes for surgery," he explained as he mixed the first batch of tea, a pungent blend of echinacea, golden seal, and other herbs Eliza couldn't identify by smell alone. "The taste is bitter. I'm afraid, but the effects are worth it." Indeed, the tea proved challenging to swallow, but Eliza dutifully consumed every drop, viewing each bitter sip as a step toward potential sight. The compress, applied tepid to her closed eyelids, was more pleasant, a soothing mixture that smelled of chamomile and something resinous. "Tomorrow, we'll begin exercises to prepare your eyes for the adjustment to light," Daniel continued. "Since you've lived in darkness your entire life, sudden exposure to bright light could be overwhelming or even painful. We'll start with very brief, controlled exposures to gradually acclimate your eyes." The next 5 days fell into a rhythm of treatments, exercises, and cautious preparation. Each morning, Daniel checked Eliza's eyes for signs that the herbs were reducing inflammation. Each afternoon, they practiced with carefully controlled light exposure, just seconds at first, with Eliza reporting the sensations she experienced. And each evening, Jackson would ask detailed questions about the day's progress and the upcoming procedure. On the 4th day of preparation, as Eliza sat in Daniel's treatment room with herbal compresses on her eyes, she heard her father and the healer conversing in the adjacent office, apparently unaware that their voices carried. "You've done this procedure how many times?" Jackson was asking. 9 cases of congenital cataracts," Daniel replied patiently, though Eliza suspected he had answered this question before. 7 with significant improvement in vision. "And the 2 that didn't improve?" "One developed an infection that we controlled, but it left scarring that limited visual improvement." The other simply didn't respond as hoped. The optic nerve had atrophied over years without use. Daniel's voice softened. I don't believe either of those complications is likely in Eliza's case. Her overall health is excellent, and the light sensitivity tests suggest her optic nerves are responsive. A pause followed, during which Eliza imagined her father absorbing this information, weighing it against his fears. She's all I have left, Jackson finally said, his voice so low Eliza had to strain to hear it. After Margaret died, Eliza became my whole world, even if I didn't show it as I should have. I understand, Daniel replied with equal gravity. I will treat her with the same care I would my own daughter. The vulnerability in her father's admission brought tears to Eliza's eyes, dampening the herbal compresses. All these years, she had interpreted his emotional distance as disappointment or shame, never considering that it might stem from an overwhelming love coupled with fear of loss. On the eve of her surgery, Eliza found herself too excited and anxious to sleep. She sat outside their cabin in the cool night air, listening to the symphony of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Jackson joined her after a time, settling onto the bench with a sigh. Nervous? He asked. Yes, she admitted, but I'm hopeful too. Your mother would be proud of your courage, Jackson said unexpectedly. She always believed you would find your way in the world, despite my attempts to shield you from it. Eliza absorbed this rare mention of her mother, treasuring it like a precious gift. Tell me about her, she requested softly, something I don't already know. Jackson was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth she seldom heard. She loved thunderstorms, he said. While most folks would rush indoors, Margaret would stand on the porch, face turned up to the rain, grinning like a child when lightning flashed across the sky, said it made her feel truly alive to be so close to something so powerful and beautiful and dangerous all at once. He chuckled softly at the memory. First big storm after we were married, I thought she'd lost her mind. Found her dancing in the downpour, laughing like it was the most natural thing in the world. By the second storm, I was out there with her. I wish I could remember her better, Eliza said wistfully. You're more like her than you know, Jackson replied. She had the same quiet strength, the same determination. When you stood up to me about seeing Running Bear, the look on your face was pure Margaret. They sat together in companionable silence until the night chill finally drove them inside. As Eliza settled into her cot, Jackson paused beside her. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I want you to know I'm proud of you, Eliza. Prouder than I've ever been of anything in my life. Unable to speak through the tightness in her throat, Eliza simply reached for his hand and pressed it to her cheek, letting actions convey what words could not. Dawn arrived clear and bright, the morning of transformation. Daniel had scheduled Eliza's surgery for early morning, when the light was optimal and he was at his freshest. She awoke to find her father already dressed and pacing the small cabin, his anxiety manifesting in restless energy. Today's the day, he said when he noticed she was awake. How do you feel? Ready, Eliza replied with more confidence than she felt. The mixture of anticipation, hope, and fear was almost overwhelming, but beneath it all lay a bedrock of certainty that this was the right path, regardless of the outcome. Joseph arrived to escort them to the clinic, where they found Daniel already preparing the surgical suite. He greeted Eliza warmly, checking her eyes one final time and explaining once more what the procedure would entail. We'll focus on your right eye today, he reminded her. The surgery itself takes about an hour, after which you'll need to rest, with both eyes covered for 24 hours. The initial bandages will be removed tomorrow, but you'll wear a protective covering over the treated eye for several days as it heals. Eliza nodded her understanding, her throat too dry for speech. "Mr. Blackwood," Daniel continued, turning to Jackson, "you may remain with Eliza until the anesthesia takes effect. But during the procedure itself, I must ask you to wait outside. Joseph will keep you informed of our progress." Jackson's grip on Eliza's hand tightened momentarily. "I understand," he said gruffly. As the final preparations were made, Eliza found herself thinking of all the steps that had led to this moment. Her secret journey to town, the confrontation with her father, Dr. Morrison's visit, the long trip to the reservation. Each had seemed insurmountable at the time, yet each had been overcome through courage, determination, and the grudging opening of minds and hearts. "It's time," Daniel finally said, helping Eliza onto the surgical table. "Are you ready?" Eliza took a deep breath, reaching into her pocket to touch the serpentine stone one last time. "Yes," she said clearly. "I'm ready." Jackson leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it momentarily startled her. "I'll be right outside," he promised. "See you soon, daughter." As he stepped away, Daniel began administering the anesthesia. A combination of Western medicine and traditional herbs that would keep Eliza conscious but insensitive to pain. The last thing she remembered before the procedure began was the gentle pressure of Daniel's hand on her shoulder and his calm, confident voice. "Now let's bring light into your world." The hours of waiting seemed endless to Jackson Blackwood as he paced outside the surgical room. Walter sat nearby, his weathered hands methodically carving a small piece of wood, a habit that had always calmed his nerves during times of stress. "She'll be fine," Walter said, not for the first time. "Dr. Running Bear knows what he's doing." Jackson merely nodded, words failing him as anxiety tightened his chest. Every few minutes, Joseph would emerge with brief updates. "The cataract has been successfully removed. Dr. Running Bear is now preparing the fish membrane. The membrane has been placed, and Dr. Running Bear is closing the incision." Each report brought momentary relief, followed by renewed tension as Jackson contemplated all that could still go wrong. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the door opened, and Daniel appeared, his face tired but satisfied. "The surgery went perfectly," he announced. "No complications, excellent placement of the membrane, minimal trauma to surrounding tissues." Jackson released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "And when will we know if it worked? If she can see?" "Tomorrow morning we'll remove the initial bandages and conduct some basic tests," Daniel explained. "But I must caution you, even in the best cases, vision doesn't return instantly or completely. The brain needs time to learn how to interpret the new visual information it's receiving, especially for someone who has never seen it before." "Can I see her now?" Jackson asked, already moving toward the door. "She's being moved to the recovery room," Daniel confirmed. "She'll be groggy from the anesthesia but awake." Jackson found Eliza lying still on a narrow bed, both eyes covered with bandages secured by a cloth wrapped around her head. Her face was pale but peaceful, her hands resting lightly on the blanket covering her. "Father," she murmured as he approached, recognizing his footsteps even in her sedated state. "I'm here," he said, taking her hand gently. "The surgery is over. Dr. Running Bear says everything went well." A small smile curved her lips. "Good," she whispered. "I feel strange. Floating." "That's the medicine," Jackson explained. You should rest now." "Stay," she requested, her fingers tightening slightly around his. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. That night, Jackson kept vigil beside Eliza's bed, dozing occasionally in a chair, but never leaving. Daniel checked on his patient several times, examining the bandages and administering herbal preparations to prevent infection and reduce swelling. By morning, Eliza was fully alert, though the bandages still shrouded her in darkness. "Is it time yet?" she asked eagerly when she heard Daniel enter the room. "Soon," he assured her. "Let me check a few things first." After examining the surgical site through a small adjustment to the bandages, Daniel pronounced himself satisfied with the initial healing. "We can proceed with removing the outer bandages," he announced. "However, the treated eye will still be covered with a protective patch for several more days." "But I'll be able to see out of my left eye?" Eliza asked, confusion evident in her voice. "That's right," Daniel confirmed. "While we couldn't treat both eyes simultaneously due to infection risk, removing the full head bandage will allow you to begin adjusting to light with your untreated eye. It's an important first step." Jackson held Eliza's hand as Daniel carefully unwound the bandages. "Keep your eyes closed initially," the healer instructed. "When I tell you, open only your left eye very slowly. The light may be intense at first." As the final layer of bandage fell away, Jackson found himself holding his breath again. Eliza's face was revealed fully, a dark patch still covering her right eye, her left eye closed as instructed. "Ready?" Daniel asked gently. "Open your left eye just a little at first." Eliza's eyelid fluttered, then opened the slightest fraction. Immediately she gasped, her hand shooting up to shield her face. "Bright," she whispered. "So bright." "That's normal," Daniel reassured her. "Your eye has never been exposed to light before. Take your time. Open it just a little more when you're ready." Over the next several minutes, Eliza gradually adapted, her eye opening slightly wider with each attempt. Jackson watched in wonder as expressions he'd never seen before flitted across his daughter's face. Surprise, confusion, wonder. "I see something," she said, uncertainty. "Shapes, I think, light and dark areas." "That's excellent," Daniel encouraged. "Your untreated eye has cataracts too, so vision will be very limited, but even this minimal perception is valuable preparation for when we remove the patch from your right eye." For the rest of that day, Eliza practiced with her limited vision, slowly identifying the location of windows from their brightness, distinguishing between people based on their shapes and movements. Though far from true sight, these small victories filled the recovery room with a palpable sense of hope. "Tomorrow," Daniel promised as evening approached, "if the healing continues well, we'll remove the patch from your right eye for a brief assessment." That night Eliza found sleep impossible. "Talk to me, Father," she requested as they sat together in the dim recovery room. "Describe the colors again." Jackson, who had spent the past days recounting the colors of the Montana landscape, searched for new descriptions. "Blue is the color of the sky on a clear day," he began, repeating information he'd shared before, but which Eliza never tired of hearing. "But it's also the color of the tiny flowers that grow beside the creek in spring, and the deep shadows on snow in winter. It changes, shifts with the light." "And my eyes, what color are they?" "Hazel," Jackson replied. "Like your mother's. Sometimes more green, sometimes more brown, depending on what you're wearing or the quality of light." "I hope I can see them someday," Eliza said softly. "In a mirror." "You will," Jackson assured her with a confidence he hadn't felt before witnessing her progress. The next morning brought the moment they'd been waiting for. Daniel arrived early, carefully examining Eliza's right eye before determining it was ready for a brief exposure. "Remember," he cautioned, "vision will be blurry at first, and you may see only light and shadows initially. Don't be discouraged if details aren't clear immediately." With painstaking care, he removed the protective patch. "Keep your eye closed until I say," he instructed, "and when you open it, expect significant light sensitivity." Jackson moved to Eliza's side, his heart pounding. After 15 years of darkness, after the long journey from isolation to hope, after all the fears and doubts and resistance he had put in her path, this moment felt like both an ending and a beginning. "All right, Eliza," Daniel said quietly. "You can open your eye now, very slowly." Eliza's eyelid trembled, then lifted. For a moment, her expression remained blank, her newly revealed eye blinking rapidly against the light. Then suddenly, her breath caught, and her hand reached out blindly, searching. "Father," she whispered. Jackson took her hand, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. "I'm here." Eliza turned toward his voice, her gaze unfocused but unmistakably directed at his face. I think I see you," she said, wondering, breaking through in her voice. Are you there? The shape?" "Yes," Jackson managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, I'm right here." "You're blurry," she said with a small, disbelieving laugh. "But you're there. I can see something. Someone. You." Daniel observed with professional satisfaction, making notes on a small pad. "This is an excellent initial response," he confirmed. "The membrane appears to be functioning as intended." But Jackson barely heard him, transfixed by the sight of his daughter seeing, truly seeing, for the first time. Her eyes, though still unfocused, moved with purpose now, tracking movement, discovering depth and dimension in a world that had previously existed only in description. "Your face," Eliza said wonderingly, reaching up with tentative fingers. "It matches your voice. Strong, solid." Her fingertips brushed his cheek, coming away wet with tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. "Why are you crying?" "Because I can finally see you too," Jackson replied. "The daughter I've always had, but never fully known." Over the following weeks, Eliza's vision in her right eye steadily improved. Daily exercises strengthened her ability to focus, distinguish objects, and eventually identify colors. Daniel explained that her progress was remarkable, faster than he had dared hope for someone blind from birth. "The brain is a marvelous instrument," he observed, as Eliza correctly identified a series of colored cards during one examination. "Yours seems particularly eager to embrace this new sense." 6 weeks after the first surgery, with Eliza's right eye healing well and her visual cortex demonstrating excellent adaptation, Daniel performed the procedure on her left eye. The recovery was smoother this time, Eliza now understanding what to expect, and her brain primed to interpret the new visual information. By early autumn, as the cottonwoods along the river turned gold, Eliza stood with her father at the edge of the reservation, gazing out at the landscape with eyes that could now distinguish mountains from sky, clouds from sunlight, the varied greens of pine and sage and grass. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she said softly. "All these years of descriptions, and still I couldn't have known." Jackson watched his daughter's face, the wonder there a mirror to the transformation in his own heart. "What now?" he asked. "We could return to the ranch or Eliza prompted when he trailed off. "Or we could see more of the world," he suggested. "Denver, perhaps, or even back east to Philadelphia or New York, places with different sights than Montana offers." Eliza considered this, her newly functional eyes taking in the vast landscape before her. "First home," she decided. "I want to see the ranch, the place that's been my whole world. I want to see Mrs. Sullivan's face when she realizes I can see her now. I want to ride a horse and actually see where I'm going." She turned to her father, her gaze direct and clear in a way that still astonished him. And then, yes, the world. All of it. As they prepared for the journey home, Eliza sought out Daniel one last time, finding him gathering herbs near the clinic. "I came to thank you," she said simply, "not just for my sight, but for showing my father a different way of seeing, too." Daniel smiled, recognition of the double meaning evident in his eyes. "The greatest healing happens when we open ourselves to possibilities beyond our familiar boundaries," he said. "You and your father have both done that in your own ways." Eliza pressed the serpentine stone into his palm. "For your next patient who needs to believe change is possible." The return journey to Blackwood Ranch was a revelation for Eliza. The landscape unfolding before her eyes in all its autumn glory, the changing ecosystems shifting from Reservation Valley to rolling prairie to the familiar foothills of home. Each mile brought new discoveries, new colors, new understandings of a world previously known only through touch, sound, and description. When the ranch house finally came into view, Eliza stood in the wagon, drinking in the sight of the place that had been both sanctuary and prison. The whitewashed walls, the broad porch, the distant barns and corrals, all exactly as she'd imagined in some ways, completely different in others. Mrs. Sullivan stood waiting on the porch, her hands clutched anxiously at her apron. As the wagon drew closer, Eliza's eyes filled with tears at her first glimpse of the woman who had been her closest connection to the outside world for so many years. "Welcome home!" Mrs. Sullivan called, then gasped as Eliza's gaze met hers directly. "Child, can you—" "I can see you," Eliza confirmed, joy bubbling through her voice. "I can finally see you." Camera pans out slowly as Eliza embraces Mrs. Sullivan. The ranch spreading out behind them, mountains in the distance. Narrator's voice, gentle and reflective. Eliza Blackwood would go on to see much of the world she had once known only through others' descriptions. She studied at a women's college in Boston, traveled through Europe, and eventually returned to Montana to establish the state's first school for visually impaired children, using both Western medical approaches and some of the traditional Cheyenne techniques she had learned from Dr. Running Bear. Jackson Blackwood never rebuilt the walls he had once constructed around his daughter. Instead, he became one of the region's most vocal advocates for combining traditional and Western medicine, helping to fund a proper clinic at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation that continued Dr. Running Bear's groundbreaking work for generations to come. And in the foothills of Montana's Bitterroot Valley, the place where shame once kept a young girl hidden away became a beacon of hope for families facing similar challenges. A testament to the healing power of courage, the strength found in vulnerability, and the light that can enter when we finally open doors long kept shut. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.